When I first moved into the small apartment on the east side of the city, it wasn't because I wanted a new adventure, it was because my bank account left me no choice. Rent alone could have drained me in 2 months, and a roommate seemed like the only logical solution. That's how I met Ethan. He was already in the unit when I arrived, leaning casually against the kitchen counter with a mug of coffee, his sleeves pushed up and his hair still damp from a shower. There was a calm confidence in the way he moved, as if he had nothing to prove to anyone. We exchanged polite introductions, but within minutes, the conversation felt warmer, more natural, like we'd skipped the awkward stranger phase entirely. Ethan wasn't loud or overbearing, but he had a presence that filled the space. His humor was understated, often arriving in the form of quick, clever remarks that caught me off guard. In the first week, we discovered a rhythm splitting grocery runs, cooking simple dinners, and leaving notes on the fridge when our schedules didn't overlap. Living together felt unexpectedly easy. It didn't take long before our evenings began to stretch into late nights. We'd sit on the worn couch, trading stories about past relationships, bad dates, and half-forgotten college parties. Ethan had a way of listening that made you feel as though every word carried weight. Sometimes his laughter would linger a beat too long, or his gaze would hold mine for just a moment more than casual friendship required. I told myself it was nothing, but small things kept catching my attention. His hand brushing mine when we passed each other in the narrow kitchen, the way his voice softened when he said my name, the glint of amusement in his eyes when he teased me about my messy desk. I didn't think much of it at first. After all, people can be naturally warm without meaning anything by it. Still, I had to admit there was an undercurrent between us, unspoken, unacknowledged, yet impossible to ignore. I had someone in my life, a long-distance partner named Daniel, and that fact alone should have been enough to keep my thoughts in check. But living with Ethan meant his presence seeped into the ordinary parts of my day. The sound of him humming in the shower, the faint smell of his cologne drifting from the hallway, the low, steady rhythm of his breathing, when we both stayed up too late watching old movies. One Friday evening, the air outside carried the sharp bite of approaching winter. I'd been buried in notes for a work project, my laptop balanced precariously on my knees. Ethan walked in from his shift, kicked off his boots, and tossed me a look that was equal parts exhaustion and mischief. "You're still working?" he asked, dropping his bag on the floor. "Deadline," I muttered, glancing up. He shrugged, made himself a cup of tea, and settled into the armchair across from me. For a while, the only sound in the room was the faint tapping of my keys and the occasional sip from his mug. Then he spoke quietly, almost like he was testing the air. "You work too hard," he said. It wasn't the words themselves, but the way he said them. Slow, deliberate, like he'd been holding them in. I felt my shoulders tighten, unsure why such a simple observation had made the room feel smaller. By the time the clock neared midnight, my eyes ached from the screen. Ethan had stretched out in the armchair, one leg over the armrest, half asleep but still faintly smiling. "Call it a night," he mumbled without opening his eyes. I closed the laptop, too tired to protest, and collapsed onto the couch instead of making the short trip to my bedroom. The cushions held the faint scent of detergent and something that was distinctly thin. My mind floated between exhaustion and the quiet hum of our unspoken closeness. The apartment lights were dim, casting the living room in soft gold shadows. I felt myself sinking into the warmth of the blanket, my breathing slowing, thoughts blurring. Somewhere in the distance, I heard Ethan shifting in the chair. The sound was faint footsteps on the hardwood, deliberate and slow. They stopped just short of where I lay. My eyes were closed, but I could sense him there, the weight of his presence settling over the moment. And then the silence pressed in, heavy enough that I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. I kept my eyes shut, my breathing steady, hoping that if Ethan was standing there, he'd believe I was asleep. But awareness had sharpened every sense. Faint rustle of fabric as he shifted his weight, the muted creak of the floorboard beneath him, a trace of his colon warm, earthy, and clean drifted toward me. It was the scent I'd noticed countless times before in passing, but here, in the stillness, it felt amplified. My mind scrambled for an explanation. Maybe he'd come to grab a blanket or check if I was comfortable. Logical, innocent reasons. And yet, his nearness lingered. I felt movement, subtle, tentative. The edge of the blanket lifted slightly, just enough for cooler air to touch my arm. A moment later, his fingers brushed against my forearm. It wasn't a casual touch. It was slow, deliberate, like he was memorizing the shape of it. My instinct screamed to open my eyes, to say something, but another part of me stayed frozen. It was easier to let the moment unfold than to confront it. That thought alone unsettled me. I could feel the warmth of his hand, the hesitation in it, as though he was giving me time to react. My mind flickered to Daniel, to the promises I'd made, to the quiet trust between us. But Ethan's proximity blurred those lines until they felt distant, almost unreal. Ethan exhaled softly, the sound low and close to my ear. My pulse spiked. The blanket shifted again, as his hand hovered, then settled lightly against my shoulder. He didn't grip or press, just rested there. The weight of it both comforting and electric. In the dim quiet, I could almost believe this was some shared dream, that when I opened my eyes, he'd be back in the armchair, and none of this would matter. But I stayed still, my lashes pressed together, listening to the uneven rhythm of his breathing. Then, just as slowly as he'd approached, Ethan withdrew. His touch slipped away, the blanket fell back into place, and the sound of his footsteps retreated across the hardwood. A chair creaked softly a moment later, followed by the faint clink of a mug on the coffee table. I opened my eyes only when I was sure he wasn't looking. The room was exactly as before: dim light, shadowed corners, the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, and yet nothing felt the same. My skin still carried the ghost of his touch. My thoughts tangled between guilt and a quiet, unspoken curiosity. Questions crowded my mind. What had driven him to cross that invisible line tonight? Was it impulsive, or had he been holding back for weeks, waiting for a moment like this? More importantly, why hadn't I stopped him? I shifted slightly under the blanket, the fabric brushing against my skin in a way that made me acutely aware of my own body. My thoughts were no longer just about Ethan's actions, but my own inaction. I told myself I'd confront him in the morning, that we'd have an honest conversation about boundaries. But a quieter, more dangerous voice in my mind whispered that I wasn't sure I wanted to shut this door completely. Across the room, Ethan moved again. I caught a glimpse of his silhouette, head tilted back against the chair, eyes closed. His posture was relaxed, almost like nothing had happened, but the tension in his jaw betrayed him. I wondered if he was replaying the moment the same way I was. The clock on the wall ticked toward 2 a.m., each second stretching the space between us wider. Eventually, I rolled onto my side, facing the back of the couch. The darkness there felt safer, easier than meeting the shadowed outline of the man who had just, in one subtle act, changed the terms of our friendship. I lay awake long after his breathing deepened into the steady rhythm of sleep. My thoughts kept circling the same truth. There would be no going back from this, not for him, and not for me. And yet, morning was coming, and I had no idea which version of Ethan I would see when the sun came up. Morning arrived in thin bands of light filtering through the living room blinds. I woke to the smell of coffee and the quiet clatter of dishes from the kitchen. For a moment, I let myself pretend the night before had been a dream, something my tired mind had conjured, but the memory was too sharp, too precise, to be imagined. Ethan stood at the counter, stirring sugar into his mug. He glanced over when he heard me shift on the couch. "Morning," he said, his tone light, casual, almost too casual. "Morning," I replied, my voice rough. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, not because of the cold, but because I suddenly felt exposed. He poured a second cup of coffee and slid it toward me without asking. "You were out cold last night," he said, eyes on the steam rising from his own cup. The words were simple, but the weight behind them wasn't. I wondered if this was his way of pretending nothing had happened, or if he was waiting for me to bring it up first. The silence between us stretched, thick with all the things left unsaid. I finally broke it. "Ethan, about last night." His hand froze midway to his mouth. He set the mug down slowly, meeting my eyes for the first time that morning. "I know," he said quietly. I crossed the line. I searched his face for signs of regret, but found something else instead: hesitation. Yes, but also a flicker of vulnerability. "Why?" I asked. He leaned back against the counter, rubbing the back of his neck. "Because I've been holding back for months," he admitted. I told myself it was just a crush, that I could ignore it. "But last night, you were right there, and he trailed off, as if the rest of the sentence would only make things worse. The honesty in his voice left me off balance. I wanted to be angry, to tell him what he did was wrong, but another part of me, the part that hadn't pulled away, kept me rooted in place. "Ethan, I'm with Daniel," I reminded him, the name catching in my throat. "I know," he said, softer now, "and I'm not trying to come between you. I just couldn't stop myself." That confession sat between us like a lit match, small, but dangerous if left unattended. I gripped the mug tightly, letting the heat burn into my palms. "We can't let that happen again," I said, though the conviction in my voice wavered. He nodded, but the look in his eyes told me the conversation wasn't over. Not really. The day went on in fragments. We moved around the apartment with a careful awareness of each other's space, exchanging brief glances but few words. Every time our paths crossed in the hallway, at the sink, by the fridge, I felt a subtle pull, an echo of last night's closeness. That evening, as I passed the living room, Ethan spoke my name. I stopped, turning to find him sitting on the couch, elbows resting on his knees. "I meant it," he said. "What I feel for you. It's not going away." I stayed in the doorway, the air between us taut. "You're making this harder," I said, but my voice lacked the bite I intended. "Maybe," he admitted, "but I'd rather be honest than pretend it isn't there." For a moment, neither of us moved. I thought about Daniel, about the life we'd built in messages, calls, and rare visits, but I also thought about Ethan, the late-night conversations, the shared laughter, the unspoken connection that had grown in the quiet spaces of our days. Temptation pressed in like a tide, and for a heartbeat I considered stepping closer, but something in me pulled back. "Good night, Ethan," I said, forcing my feet to carry me down the hall. In my room, I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling. The sound of the TV faintly drifted from the living room, a reminder that Ethan was still out there, just a few steps away. I thought about boundaries, about trust, and about how easily both could fracture. One night had redrawn the lines between us, and I wasn't sure if they could ever be put back. Sometimes betrayal isn't about what you do, it's about what you let happen.